My name is Nzioki, and I'd like to welcome you to this live Facebook video. And I'd like to speak about climate governance. Climate change is one of the biggest challenges that the world is facing today. And as you've seen around the world, several countries have even declared it a national emergency. And there have been several efforts from different states on trying to address climate change. At the international level, the climate change discourse is governed by the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which dictates the policy framework for climate change management across the globe. So when it comes to the matters of climate governance, here we are discussing about how decisions are made and how inclusive they are, especially for the most vulnerable and those who are affected most by the impacts of climate change. We are also trying to look at how the different parties to the different international treaties and conventions around climate change are adhering to their obligations, and how these are impacting on the livelihoods and also on the economies of the different countries. We're also trying to look at how inclusive decision-making processes are and how different stakeholders are being engaged in the discourse, and particularly around climate finance. And when we come to climate finance, this is a very important issue, because in the process of trying to address climate change, a lot of financial resources are really required in order to ensure that the interventions, either by adaptation or mitigation, are met. And when I talk about adaptation, I mean building the resilience of communities and ensuring that vulnerabilities are reduced. And on the converse, when I talk about mitigation, I'm talking about reducing greenhouse gases that are blamed for the global warming effect that leads to climate change. So these resources need to be safeguarded from corruption and corrupt practices to ensure that they achieve their intention and that they deliver on what they intended to do. And when you look at the global landscape for climate finance, back in 2009, countries in Copenhagen, developed countries, pledged to mobilize $100 billion in the form of climate finance. And if these resources are not used for the rightful purpose, then this will leave communities and countries most vulnerable to climate change in dire situations. We've seen in the recent past how disasters related to climate change have devastated nations. You remember about the hurricane in Madagascar, and you will continue experiencing such kind of disasters as the years go by, and as the impacts of climate change continue to manifest in significant manners. So when we talk about climate governance, we're talking about ensuring these resources are used for the rightful purpose. And one key intervention that Transparency International is trying to work on is related to corruption risks around climate finance. And this stems from the fact that developing countries are the most affected by the impacts of climate change. And on the flip side, developing countries are also the most poorly ranked when it comes to the Corruption Perception Index that Transparency International publishes. So that means there's an inherent risk of corruption of climate finance flows in the developing countries, which are most affected by climate change. And this means then that there's a need to ensure that climate finance and climate resources are safeguarded from the already existing corruption risks, so that communities are safeguarded and we achieve our targets as stipulated in the Paris Agreement and the nationally determined contributions that countries have pledged to meet within certain deadlines. I'll give an example of Kenya and how it has performed in the Corruption Perception Index. And as you know, Kenya and also within the African continent, Kenya is one of the most vulnerable countries in terms of climate change. We experience droughts year in, year out. We've had floods affecting our communities, and we also know on the other side that Kenya is really struggling to deal with corruption. And corruption has been identified as one of the biggest derailments to development in this country. In the 2018 Corruption Perception Index, for instance, Kenya was ranked 144 out of 180 countries. And so you can see the relationship between the climate risks that are there and also the corruption risks when it comes to resources that are meant to address these challenges. And when we try to look deeper into the corruption risks that are involved around climate finance, they're not so different from the different scandals that bedevil. And some of these risks include a lack of transparency and public disclosure, especially on the decision-making processes and the climate finance investments that are involved, whereby decisions are just made by an elite few and are not disclosed to the public, especially on climate finance investments and where, for instance, the sources of these finances and what they are supposed to do. Another risk is the policy capture and undue influence by people in authority, whereby people use their power to influence decisions around climate finance investments. We have a conflict of interest, people involved in decision-making processes that they are directly, decisions that are going to directly affect them or directly improve or benefit them. Then there's creative accounting and reporting, especially when it comes to emissions and emission reductions, and also on climate finance flows. There's also a risk of double counting of resources, financial resources, and emissions from countries in order to perhaps gain financial resources in terms of carbon credits, for instance. Then we have mismanagement of public resources, which are meant really to help the poor and the most vulnerable to address the issue of climate change. And one key area that we're also interested in, and that is a big risk, is the lack of public participation and civic engagement in decision-making processes around climate change and climate finance investments. And I think I had mentioned this earlier, where just decisions on where climate finances should go are just made by people seated in capital cities, not really involving those down in the village level that are really impacted by the impacts of climate change. And with this background, Transparency International Kenya has been trying to work on different interventions to try and address the corruption risks and the governance challenges in the climate change discourse. And one of them is through policy and legislative interventions, where we try and strengthen existing policies to capture the tenets of good governance and enhance transparency and accountability, or where they are non-existent, we'll also develop them from scratch. Then we have a big component on research, which really brings out our component on evidence-based advocacy, where we try to engage with policy makers from a point of research and information on interventions that should be implemented from a policy perspective and also from a legal perspective. Then we have capacity building on different topics covering climate change, climate governance, and climate finance. And this is essentially to build the knowledge of stakeholders and the capacity of stakeholders to effectively engage with the processes. And also we have networking and partnership building, which is mainly geared to forming communities of practice that can be engaged in holding the duty bearers accountable for the decisions that are made, and also for the climate finance investments that are made. And I think this video today forms a basis of a series of videos that we will tease out different aspects of climate change and climate governance. And this was just an introductory video, and I hope you can write your questions or comments on the comment box, and then I will get back to you. Until next time.